Today we are going to discuss an important topic for the emergency physicians: approach to traumatic shock. Trauma is one of the most common causes of death, especially in the younger population. Severe hemorrhage after trauma carries a mortality rate of about 30 to 40%, and hemorrhagic shock is responsible for 50% of deaths in the first 24 hours. Hemorrhagic shock is also responsible for delayed deaths due to post-registration organ injury. Hemorrhagic shock is defined as acute blood loss leading to an imbalance between oxygen supply and demand. This is the pathophysiology of hemorrhagic shock. You can find the most common causes leading to death in these patients are hypothermia, acidosis, and trauma-induced coagulopathy. These three entities, namely acidosis, hypothermia, and coagulopathy leading to end organ damage, is called the dangerous triad of trauma. So your aim is to prevent these three entities from occurring or treat them appropriately once they occur. So let us get into pathophysiology. Soon after a major trauma, there is a severe blood loss. The severe blood loss leads to initially trigger of physiological responses like secretion of cortisol, secretion of adrenal hormones. So they can temporarily compensate and maintain blood flow to the vital organs. These compensatory mechanisms include, as I told already, secretion of hormones which lead to increased force of contractility and increased cardiac output, and secondly there will be vascular constriction leading to increased perfusion of the tissues. Finally there will be movement of blood from the non-essential organs to the essential organs, that is from cutaneous circulation to the visceral circulation. Movement of blood will be there, so that maintains perfusion to the vital organs. Severe blood loss can also lead to loss of clotting factors along with white blood cells, subsequent high volume crystallite registration. Both of them can lead to hypothermia, loss of blood, and subsequent high volume crystallite replacement at room temperature can lead to hypothermia. And one more mechanism for hypothermia is when you are doing an examination on the patient, if you open the dress completely and leave it for longer periods without covering with blankets, that can lead to hypothermia. Then you have, because of loss of clotting factors, you have blood dilution and reduction in level of the overall clotting factors, which can lead to coagulopathy and end organ damage. Coagulopathy has many causes which can lead to coagulopathy. Once there is severe blood loss and the compensatory mechanisms fail, there is setup of hemorrhagic shock. This hemorrhagic shock can lead to hypoperfusion and inadequate waste removal. That leads to acidosis, a reduced blood volume and hemoglobin, and there is reduced oxygen delivery to the tissues, which can lead to predominantly anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic metabolism end product is the lactate, which can accumulate, leading to lactic acidosis. And there is global vascular endothelial damage because of the trauma, along with the local endothelial damage, which can activate coagulation and the inflammatory systems, and that leads to coagulopathy. This coagulopathy is accentuated by the acidosis. So this is the pathophysiology of trauma-induced hemorrhagic shock. You have to know a bit more detail about the mechanism of trauma-induced coagulopathy. As I told earlier, there is either local endothelial damage because of direct effects of trauma or hemorrhagic shock leading to diffuse vascular injury. This vascular injury will lead to a release of thrombomodulin. Thrombomodulin binds with the thrombin and forms a thrombin-thrombomodulin complex. So there is a relative deficiency of thrombin. Thrombin is required for conversion of fibrinogen into thrombin is required for conversion of fibrinogen into fibrin. When there is lack of thrombin, fibrinogen is not converted into thrombin. And this thrombin thrombomodulin complex in turn activates protein C. Protein C is converted into activated protein C, which acts on plasmin activator inhibitor 1 and again inhibits the degradation of fibrin into fibrin degradation products. So there is a relative hyperfibrinogenemia because of lack of fibrinogen degradation. And because of fibrinogen is not degraded into fibrin, enough clots will not be formed, leading to increased blood loss. So this is the mechanism of coagulopathy in trauma-induced hemorrhagic shock. So what are the clinical features? How are you going to clinically assess that a patient is in hemorrhagic shock? We have certain hemodynamic response changes, that is, as I already discussed, because of compensatory mechanisms. There will be tachycardia, tachypnea, and because of loss of blood you can find hypotension, and you can have signs of poor peripheral perfusion, cool, pale, clammy extremities with weak peripheral pulses and prolonged capillary refill. There is narrowing of pulse pressure because of vasoconstriction, which leads to increase in diastolic blood pressure also for better perfusion. There's cerebral hypoperfusion, which can lead to altered mental status. So whenever you find a trauma patient who is having altered mental status, don't think of only head injury, think of blood loss and hemorrhagic shock. If you cannot identify a definitive site of bleeding externally, look for internal bleeding into the peritoneum and the pleural cavities. And if you find a patient with head injury who is in hypotension, that you are looking at a patient with hemorrhagic shock, even if you are not having other signs. Signs and symptoms become more pronounced with increased blood loss, and you can find evidence of other organ damage with progression of shock and if it is left untreated. Hemorrhagic shock can be classified into 4 classes, mainly based on the amount of blood loss which can be estimated and other physiological parameters. In class 3, there is 15% of blood loss. All the physiological parameters will be normal. Base deficit will also be normal, and this patient doesn't need any aggressive treatment or blood transfusion. Class 2, there is 15 to 30% of blood loss. There can be a slight tachycardia. There can be a slight drop in pulse pressure. All other important parameters like respiratory rate, urine output, GCS will be normal. Base deficit can be slightly increased, which is to about -6 milliequivalents per liter, and this patient might need fluid resuscitation or a need for blood transfusion. In class 3 and class 4, patient will definitely need blood transfusion. Class 3 is 30 to 40% of blood loss. There is tachycardia, tachypnea with drop in blood pressure, and there is decreased urine output. You will find this patient in altered sensorium. Base deficit will be up to -10 milliequivalents per liter. Class 4, greater than 40% of blood loss. There will be severe tachycardia, severe tachypnea. GCS is very poor. Respiratory rate is very high. Base deficit will be greater than 10 milliequivalents per liter, and this patient needs massive transfusion. So this is the classification of hematological shock. But there are certain exceptions to this rule. So what are those exceptions? If you are looking at a young athletic person who is well acclimatized for exercise, these signs may not manifest well. Elderly people who are on drugs or underlying heart disease may not show the tachycardic response to volume loss. Bradycardia or lack of tachycardia may occur in intra-abdominal hemorrhage because intra-abdominal pressure is more, blood pressure is maintained, and there will not be any tachycardia. Pregnant female may have more severe tachycardia and hypotension because her blood is already diluted and her BP is generally on the lower side. So you will find more severe tachycardia and more severe hypotension for the same range of shock. And also estimation of blood loss based on the number of pads that are wet, the blood on the floor is inappropriate. You cannot exactly estimate how much blood loss is there, and you may not be able to assess the previous condition of the patient, how much blood the patient had. Even if a total volume is estimated, patient might have had anemia earlier, which might have damaged his vitals already. So this classification system doesn't hold exactly correct. So you need to assess the patient as a whole based on the clinical picture and some oxygen surrogates, which we are going to discuss in detail in the next session. Not only because of vascular injury, because of soft tissue injury also, patient can have fluid changes. Blood can be lost into the site of injury. Obese patients are at risk of significant blood loss even without fractures. Because obese patients, the soft tissues are high. Even if you are not looking at blood outside, there will be accumulation of blood within the soft tissues, leading to great loss of fluid. Elderly are also risk due to their fragile skin, and soft tissues are fragile, and there is inelastic blood vessels in them. So there will not be appropriate response to the blood loss. If a vessel is cut, there will not be appropriate vasoconstriction to reduce the amount of blood loss. So elderly will have more amount of blood loss. Secondary edema will compound the fluid loss. Systemic injury results in activation of cytokines. So activation of cytokines is the one which is going to cause all the antecedent findings in patients with trauma. Inflammation damages the vascular endothelium, leading to fluid extravasation. This is a late finding. Inflammation in the vasculature because of the endothelial damage can lead to fluid extravasation, and there is an ongoing loss inside the body. Even if you are not able to notice any outside bleeding, patient can still go into shock. So how are you going to manage? Initial management, do a proper assessment, management according to the ATLS guidelines, and management and assessment should go hand in hand simultaneously. You cannot defer management until you complete the assessment. Evaluate and dress the wounds early. If you are able to control the bleeding with manual pressure, you can give manual pressure and plan a temporary closure until definitive care can be taken. Assess and secure airway with adequate ventilation and oxygenation. Again, follow the ATLS protocols for airway management. Maintain oxygen saturation at a level greater than 95%. Massive bleeding from the extremities will require a tourniquet. Apply a pelvic binder in case you are suspecting a pelvic fracture. If patient has a reduced GCS, repeat neurological examination after correcting the circulatory status. If you see an improvement in GCS, that means patient is responding to your treatment. After addressing life-threatening injuries, perform a head-to-toe examination, which is the secondary survey. You look at all other injuries apart from the life-threatening injuries, and your main aim is to prevent hypothermia by using fluid warmth and external or internal warming devices. You have to take care of the gastric distension, which can cause hypotension and cardiac dysrhythmias by direct pressure. You have to insert a nasogastric tube early and decompress the stomach. It will also help in reducing the aspiration. Decompress the stomach and monitor urine output. Urine output is the one which is going to give you a clue about the perfusion of the internal vital organs. Blooded catheter meatus indicates urethral injury, and this contraindicates insertion of a transurethral catheter for urine output. If you are suspecting any urethral injury and there is a strong suspicion of urethral injury, you can go for a suprapubic catheter insertion for monitoring the urine output. Insert two large bore peripheral intravenous catheters. Secure intraosseous access early in case of difficult IV access. Even in adult patients, you can go for intraosseous access if there are collapsed veins because of the shock. If both are not possible, secure a large bore central venous access early in the course. So how are you going to diagnose a hemorrhagic shock? As we discussed earlier, It's not easy to depend on the signs and symptoms. Vital signs often offer little value unless they are extremely low. Blood pressure does not adequately reflect cardiac output or regional perfusion. Clinical evidence of reduced peripheral perfusion is useful, but you cannot quantitate it. There is no quantitative measure to tell exactly below this level. I will call it as shock. So this might be useful to identify shock, but you cannot quantify the shock based on evidence of peripheral perfusion. Metabolic information like acid-base analysis, assessment of mechanisms of injury, and appropriate imaging studies offer the best chance for early recognition of severe hemorrhage. So what is the metabolic information you are looking at? The most important metabolic information, that is oxygen debt. What is oxygen debt? Oxygen debt is the difference between oxygen delivery and the oxygen supply. It is the only measurement that is clearly linked to mortality and morbidity after shock, any type of shock. Measurement and normalization of lactate and base deficit are associated with better outcomes, but both of them are late indicators of shock. By the time lactate and base deficit are altered, you will have a patient who is in late shock in which organ damage has already occurred, so they may not be useful as much as they have been thought. Continuous measurement of oxygen surrogates is the only thing that is going to give you a proper measurement of shock. So what are these oxygen surrogates? Oxygen surrogates are central venous oxygen saturation and tissue oxygen saturation. You can use an invasive oximetric catheter for measurement of continuous venous oxygen saturation. SiO2 measures oxygen flux. Target SiO2 you need to maintain is greater than 70%. Near infrared spectroscopy can be used for non-invasive measurement of tissue oxygenation. Your target for tissue oxygenation is a StO2 of greater than 50%. So these two oxygen surrogates are the most important clues for presence of shock and also improvement in a patient with shock. So first is resuscitation. Management starts in pre-hospital setting and continues into the ED. Pre-hospital goals include treatment of life-threatening conditions like pneumothorax, massive hemothorax, cardiac tamponade, and rapid transport to an appropriate hospital. Appropriate hospital is very, very important because once you have shifted the patient to a certain hospital, if the facilities what the patient needs are not available, suppose patient with hemorrhagic shock, you are transported to a hospital where there is no available blood bank, it will not be useful. So I have to decide an appropriate hospital and the appropriate level of care needed for each of those patients. The ED management goals include a restore of intravascular volume, maintenance of oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, limit ongoing blood loss, and prevent hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy. These are the very, very important goals of ED management. You need to continuously monitor the patient. Continuous ECG, heart rate, saturation, and end-tidal carbon dioxide monitoring are must for any patient with shock. Monitor arterial blood pressure if needed, mental status, and the peripheral perfusion continuously. Perform in EFAST and focus. EFAST and focus will give you, if there is no external bleeding, you can find out internal bleeding in pleural or the peritoneal cavities by doing an EFAST. Focus will help you to identify the level of shock and monitor cardiac output. You can measure the IVC diameter and you can look at the aorta and find out the volume status in the patient. The principle in ER is to limit the intravascular volume expansion, avoid normalization of blood pressure to avoid secondary hemorrhage. This is called hemostatic hypotensive resuscitation. Why hemostatic hypotensive resuscitation is needed? If there is bleeding from a certain vessel, there is a clot formed. If you normalize the blood pressure, the clot might be dislocated and you have more bleeding from the site of clot. So you have to follow something called as hemostatic hypotensive registration. This is also called as controlled registration, balanced registration, hypotensive registration, or permissive hypotension. This is used as a bridge to definitive surgical control of bleeding, but it cannot replace definitive surgical control. And you cannot go on following hemostatic hypotensive registration continuously without halt. There is some point of time where still the organs can get damaged because of the hypotension. So what is the blood pressure at which you have to maintain for hypotensive registration? Systolic blood pressure is limited to 90 mmHg by most of the authorities, at a value where you don't find any adverse physiological outcomes. That is the value where you are going to limit the hypotensive registration. This hemostatic hypotensive registration is contraindicated in patients with head injury, myocardial disease or a coronary artery disease, cerebral vascular disease and peripheral vascular disease, because in these patients, if you are going to follow hypotensive registration, already there is a compromised circulation which can lead to more damage. In head injury, if you are going for hypotensive registration, the CPP will be decreased, cerebral perfusion pressure will be decreased. Because of that, there is cellular injury and you are going to increase the ICP. So you should not follow hypotensive registration in head injury. Aim is to complete definitive management as irreversible tissue damage to avoid irreversible tissue damage. Fluid registration principles. The most common fluid used is isotonic crystalloid solution. We are going to give an initial bolus of 1 liter in adults at 20 ml per kg in children. Concerns about use of crystalloids are infusion of large volumes can lead to increase in neutrophil activation. Increase in neutrophil activation in turn increases the inflammation and can lead to coagulopathy. When are giving large quantities of Ringer's solution, they can increase cytokine release, again leading to coagulopathy and increase inflammation, and also causes lactic acidosis because of the lactate component present in RL. If you are going to give normal saline in large quantities, normal saline exacerbates intracellular potassium depletion, so cell irritability is increased, and it can also cause hyperchloremic acidosis because of the chloride content in it. Not only that, fluids can also extravasate and only 30% stays in the intravascular space, another 70% is going to accumulate in the intravascular space. So whenever you are giving fluid registration with isotonic crystalloid solution, you have to give at a volume of 3:1, meaning that if there is one part of blood, suppose 1 liter of blood is lost, that is what you have estimated, you have to give 3 liters of isotonic crystalloid solutions. Imagine the volume, how much you are giving and how much you are going to dilute the intravascular compartment, leading to coagulopathy. So be sensitive while fluid registration, give only the required amounts, don't give too much of isotonic crystalloid solutions. Immediately shift to blood transfusion whenever blood is available. So you have started fluid registration. How are you going to assess the response to initial fluid therapy? There are 3 types of responses. One is the rapid response, another is transient response, another is no response. In rapid response group, vital signs returns to normal immediately once you started the crystalloid registration. Estimated blood loss is very minimal. They fall into category 1 of hemorrhagic shock. Need for blood is very low. If blood preparation, type and cross matched blood has to be given if at all blood is needed. Need for operative intervention might be there. Early presence of surgeon is needed in all the categories. Transient response is the most dangerous one, because as soon as you start fluid registration, there is transient improvement of vitals and also the resolving of shock. But soon after, recurrence of decreased blood pressure and increased heart rate will appear. If you are not monitoring this patient continuously, he is the patient who can deteriorate very rapidly and can die in front of you. So you have to be very, very careful while monitoring. You have to be continuously monitoring. Finally, minimal or no response group, usually they fall into Cat 3 or Cat 4 of the hemorrhagic shock category. Whatever is the amount of fluid registration you have given, they will remain abnormal. Immediate need for blood is there. If blood is available immediately, even before starting fistula registration, you start infusing blood. Blood preparation, emergency blood release is needed. Need for operative intervention is very, very high. Involve the surgeons very early in the course of registration. So you have some problems with the crystallite solutions. To overcome these problems, they have introduced some other solution. One of them is Hartmann's solution, which is nothing but a ringer solution with acetate replacing the lactate. So when you have acetate in place of lactate, you will not have the adverse effects which normal ringer's lactate can cause. So you are not worsening the acidosis. You can give Hartmann solution if available. And recently, balanced crystallite solutions. These balanced crystallite solutions are pH buffer solutions with a buffering agent in place, and there is a reduced amount of chloride. So whenever you are giving fluid for registration, you will not have hyperchloremic acidosis because of buffering agents. You can reduce the acidosis or buffer the already existing acidosis. So balanced crystallite solutions like isolate P are the most suitable solutions for fluid registration in a patient with shock. Coming to colloids, they don't confer any survival benefit because even though they increase and maintain the intravascular volume, they don't have any oxygen carrying capacity. So your oxygen debt is not going to be fulfilled by colloids. Not only that, they interfere with cross matching of the blood, hence colloids are contraindicated. Never ever give colloids in a patient with hemorrhagic shock. Then another most commonly used component is blood transfusion. Packed RBCs are the most commonly used blood product. Only PRBC will not improve hemodynamics or oxygenation, because whenever you are infusing packed RBCs, you are not going to improve the intravascular volume because these packed RBCs are lacking plasma. Not only that, you are going to increase the blood viscosity whenever you are giving packed cells. So with increased viscosity of the blood, the cells are deformed. You cannot expect same level of oxygenation whenever transfusing only packed RBCs. If bleeding is controlled, do not transfuse if hemoglobin of the patient is greater than 7 grams and patient has normal hemodynamics. If patient has any comorbidities like what we discussed earlier, patient is a vascular disease patient, you can have a higher threshold of hemoglobin for transfusion. Say if patient is having heart disease, you can maintain hemoglobin at a level of 10. If it falls below 10, you can think of transfusion. Typed and cross-matched PRBC are used. If you don't have time for cross-matching, you can go for a saline cross-matching or type-specific blood. Along with PRBCs, you have to infuse plasma also. Plasma is available as fresh frozen plasma, which has to be thawed before infusion. Each unit of FFP has a volume of 200 to 250 ml. An AVO compatibility is required for transfusion of plasma because antibodies can be there. When infused, it restores the plasma volume and also the coagulation factors will be supplied. Hence, when you are going to give plasma and PRBC together, you have replenishment of coagulation factors and there is restoration of plasma volume, blood viscosity will not be increased, hence oxygenation can be improved. When specific plasma is not available, you go for AB plasma, AB group plasma. In case of PRBCs, if specific typed blood is not available, you will go for O negative PRBC transfusion. In case of plasma, you go for AB plasma transfusion. There is something called as auto transfusion. What is auto transfusion? Transfusion of same patient's blood to the same patient. And why it is called auto transfusion? Blood can be collected in sterile cavities like pleural cavity and the peritoneal cavity. If that blood can be collected into sterile bagging and the sterile techniques, you can transfuse the same blood to the patient without any cross matching or any other problems. So this is called auto transfusion. There are commercial bags of tube thoracostomy available for auto transfusion. You can collect into the blood and connect to the IV line for transfusion. When this is adapted, still the patient needs plasma and platelets to be transfused. Because plasma can extravasate into the tissue spaces, only RBC component or cellular component of the blood is left in the cavities. That is what you are collecting. So still you need to transfuse plasma. How are you going to manage once coagulopathy has been established? First of all, any trauma patient coming to you, you should take a history of anticoagulant medications. You need to check his platelets, PT, APTT, INR, fibrinogen levels and ionogen calcium levels. Prevent or reverse acidosis and don't let hypothermia happen. Correct hypocalcemia if present and target an ionogen calcium of 1.2 to 1.3. Repeat labs as required. Stop crystalloids as early as possible and transfuse blood in place of crystalloids for restoration. So if the patient is already been taking heparin, you need to reverse heparin. What is the drug you will use for heparin reversal? Is protamine 1 milligram IV for every 100 units of heparin the patient has taken. Warfarin is the another most common anticoagulant which will be used on long-term basis. For reversing oral heparin effects, you need to give vitamin K 10 mg IV in every patient who is on warfarin and had a trauma. If a chronic liver failure on a patient with Van Willebrand disease comes, you can give DDAVP 0.3 micrograms per kg IV. And if there is a serious trauma, major trauma, you can consider antifibrinolytics early in the course. If patient has presented before 1 hour to you and he doesn't have any hypotension or acidosis has not yet established, you can give tranexamic acid 10 milligrams per kg IV or Amica if it is available 5 mg IV bolus and then a continuous infusion of 1 gram per hour. So this is how you manage coagulopathy. And when you are talking about hemorrhagic shock, you need to talk about massive transfusion protocol. What do you mean by massive transfusion protocol? It's defined as requirement of greater than 10 units of PRBC over a period of 24 hours. 10% of military and 3% of civilian trauma patients will require massive transfusion protocol. Massive transfusion protocol is not an alternative for definitive surgical management. It's only an additive treatment for definitive surgical management. The ratio we are going to transfuse is 1:1:1, volume to volume. 6 units of PRBC constitutes 1 unit, 4 units of FFP is 1 unit, and 1 5-pack platelets is 1 unit. Whenever the patient is requiring more than 10 units of PRBC in a period of 24 hours, you need to follow these protocols. For every 6 units of PRBC, give 4 units of FFP and 1 5-pack platelets. That is called massive transfusion protocol. So how are you going to assess? You cannot wait for 24 hours and tell patient has required more than 10 units of blood. So I am going to transform into massive transfusion protocol. whatever damage that you could cause, you would have caused already. So you need to assess early the requirement for MTP. How are you going to assess? There is a score called Assessment of Blood Consumption Score. It uses 4 values to predict the requirement of MTP. If there is a penetrating mechanism of injury and there is vital organ damage, is one of the indications to start MTP early. Positive fast examination is another indication. Blood pressure less than 90 mmHg and a pulse rate of greater than 120 beats per minute are the indications to start MTP early. Presence of 2 or more variables has a sensitivity of for massive transfusion of 76%, the specificity of 67 to 87%. Although sensitivity is high, specificity is low with this score. And whenever you are anticipating a massive transfusion protocol, you have to draw sufficient specimens at the earliest possible time, because once you have transfused certain amount of blood, you cannot confidently cross match the blood later. So to start with only, you have to draw sufficient specimens of blood from the patient. There are certain new techniques called viscoelastic hemostatic assays. Coagulation system is composed of 80 tightly packed reactions. Based on 1 or 2 single tests, whatever you do, PT, APTT, fibrinogen levels, whatever you do, they are not going to give you a proper exact information on clotting defects. We have 2 newer techniques which mimic the blood coagulation system in vitro. They are thromboelastography and the rotational thromboelastometry, which measure both the physical and the dynamic characteristics of clotting. So they can detect trauma-induced coagulopathy and can be used to guide massive transfusion protocols better than your blood tests. So whenever available, use the viscoelastic hemostatic assays. So to summarize, diagnosis and treatment should occur simultaneously. You cannot wait for completing the diagnosis and then start treatment, because you are losing vital time in this place. Shock in majority of trauma patients is hemorrhagic unless otherwise proven. You should take it as hemorrhagic shock. Also, there can be an obstructive shock in case of massive hemopneumothorax, or if you have cardiac tamponade, that you can assess with a EFAST early, and it is a life-threatening situation, you have to attend early. Hypotensive hemostatic resuscitation is the norm until definitive surgical management can be performed. Your main goals in ED management are prevention of occurrence of acidosis, hypothermia, and coagulopathy. Take the age differences and comorbidities into account whenever you are assessing the patient or you are resuscitating the patient, and these comorbidities can guide you to resuscitate the patient better. Hardship often prepares ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. Thank you.